Hello, welcome to this session on statute overload. Are there too many laws? I'm John Holbrook and I'm going to be chairing this session. I'm delighted to have four speakers who are going to discuss this issue of whether or not there are too many laws. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. That means that David is going to speak first. That's David Fagan on my far left. David is an elected member of North Lanarkshire Council. At least for now, that is, because
2017.
because David has so far managed to resist the tide of SNP opinion, which seems to be sweeping across most of Scotland. And as you can see, he's come down to this meeting with his fellow councillor. So David's going first, and then we're going to have Daniel Lloyd on my far right. Daniel is a consumer lawyer. He's also co-author of the Blackstone's Guide to the Consumer Rights Act 2015. I see from having done an Amazon search that book is coming out on the 1st of January next year, which means sadly you won't be able to buy it as a stocking filler, but you will at least be able to read it from cover to cover before you have to take down your Christmas decorations. So that's Daniel. Then thirdly, on my right is Matthew. Matthew is a barrister at Pump Court Chambers. He's a well-known blogger at barristerblogger.com, and for his blogging he's been shortlisted for the Comment Awards Best Independent Blog of 2015. And then finally on my left is Josie Appleton. Josie is director of the Civil Liberties Group, the Manifesto Club, and she has authored The Case Against Vetting and Leafleting, A Liberty Lost. So that's our panel. David, please do kick us off.
Okay. I feel less bad reading from a speech as I look up. I can't see anyone anyway. So. In preparing for today's debate, I asked a number of friends about their opinions on the subject of statute overload. Are there too many laws? And it would be fair to say that there weren't many of them, in fact any of them, saying that they thought there should be more laws. So most people agree that there were too many laws. In fact, one of my friends, Stephen, argued strongly that there were too many laws and that there ought to be a law to stop the reading with too many laws. A few of my council colleagues did argue that legislation was a necessary element of a modern society, and to a large extent I don't disagree with that. They also argued that as the creation of law is one of the central tasks of a government, the question might be rephrased as, is there too much government? And I'll come back to that. I'm a Labour councillor. I'm not anti-state. I'm part of the state, effectively. I believe there is a need for state intervention on a range of issues. The most obvious for me being in relation to infrastructure, provision of energy, social security, including the NHS. So given that, for me, the question's about the correct level for the number of pieces of legislation passing through a parliament, and not really about numbers for me. So for me, the real question is, not is there too much legislation, but is there too much bad legislation? I should say, though, that in contradiction to everything I've just said, that I do believe that a desire to fill up a legislative timetable, and that's what happens when you get a new legislature, can lead to bad legislation. So the creation of new legislatures, such as the Scottish Parliament, can and has led to substantial increases in laws and regulations affecting the people of Scotland. According to the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, known as SPICE, in the 10 years preceding the Scottish Parliament, the number of laws passed, which specifically related to Scotland, were in single figures each year, with the exception of 1997. In total, during the 10-year period, there were 74 Scottish Acts passed. In contrast, in the 10 years following the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, there were only 3 years where the number of Acts passed was less than 10, and 2 of those were election years. In total, during that same period, that 10-year period, there were 150 Acts of the Scottish Parliament passed. So the creation of a new legislature in Scotland led to a doubling of the laws created to govern the people of Scotland. I'm actually not saying that that's necessarily in itself a bad thing. What I'm saying is that it increases the potential for bad law and the potential for it being a bad thing. When you add to that the massive level of control which the SNP now exerts both in government and the Scottish Parliament, where the committees that should scrutinise bills are almost entirely dominated by the SNP, faced by a weakened opposition, we have real potential for the creation of bad laws. So what are these laws? I'll focus on those laws which I feel are bad, therefore too much, because of their attempts to moralise, intrude and meddle. To be clear, I have to concede that previous Labour Scottish governments were equally inclined to push the boundaries of state intervention in the private sphere. It was a Labour Lib Dem government that passed the legislation preventing smoking in public places, and the anti-sectarian initiatives of the SNP were preempted by Jack McConnell, who set up those initiatives. But what I will argue, though, is the political dominance of the SNP in Scotland has led to a proliferation of laws and regulation which intrude into the private realm to an extent which is truly worrying. Bailiss Manning, who was the Dean of Stanford Law School in the 70s, described this as too much law, too fast. The most obvious examples of this in Scotland include the provision for a so-called named person within the Children and Young People Scotland Act and the Offensive Behaviour at Football and Threatening Communications Act. These are laws which reset the boundary between public and private, laws which at their heart seek to control and criminalise behaviour which the state deems to be unacceptable. The Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which Dr Stuart Waiton rightly describes as a snob's law, demonstrates a huge mistrust of the public and in particular working class males. It is, in the way it is framed, a law which attempts to deal with a problem that barely exists and which has resulted in police practice well beyond the scope of tackling sectarianism. Similarly, the provision for a named person for every child and young person under the age of 18 is truly breathtaking piece of state intervention to deal with a problem which affects a relatively small number of children and young people in Scotland. The named person's functions include advising, informing or supporting children or young people and discussing matters about them with a third-party service provider. These functions can be performed when the named person considers them necessary to promote well-being, whether parents consent or not. In fact, whether parents know or not. At an NHS conference in Edinburgh, Bob Fraser, who's an advisor to the Scottish Government's Better Life Chances Unit, suggests that parents could be reported to state officials if judged to be showing inadequate levels of, quote, love, hope and spirituality. Underline the universality of the Act, he went on to say, and this is another quote, it's about linking positive well-being and positive outcomes for all children, not just the usual suspects, not just those we identify as in need. At least he's upfront about it. We're all up for scrutiny and we better shape up. If this isn't an example of too much bad legislation, I don't know what is.
Thank you, David. Daniel.
Well, just by way of immediate response, I agree very much with the spirit of what you've said, and therefore I question why you would be accepting or supportive of state intervention beyond what is absolutely necessary. And so in my views, I think you have to be very careful when you look at always reaching for the statute book and passing new laws, because once you create a new law, you immediately do something which is, you immediately create a situation where you legalise a set of human relations which previously weren't legalised. And when you start to legalise everyday life, and that's been the trend over the last 20, 25 years, you create a set of problems where you problematise relationships which then have to be resolved through the legal apparatus of the state. And so you're inviting the state in to regulate activities that were previously not regulated by the state, and that can create all sorts of issues in terms of the way that we relate to each other as human beings, in terms of the way that problems of a social nature get resolved, and in terms of institutions accepting responsibility, or rather declining to accept responsibility after the law has stepped in to regulate areas that were previously not subject to state regulation. That being said, I'm not against all laws, obviously. As a lawyer, as other lawyers will tell you, laws are good, lots more to argue about, many more offences, many more rules to be broken. So from a narrow technical professional point of view, it's great. But from a political social point of view, I'm definitely on the side that says there are far too many statutes. That being said, let's just take a step back and think, what's a good law? There's lots of examples of what I would think of as a good law. I was just discussing it with my fellow speakers. The mid-19th century Act that criminalises most crimes against a person. What a fantastic piece of legislation. I remember reading that at university when I was studying law 20-odd years ago. And I was gobsmacked as a student who'd done a history degree to think, here's a law over 150 years old that's still being used today to police offences against a person, GBH, ABH, assault and battery. That's a law that stood the test of time, reflects socially agreed attitudes on violence against a person, and has been used very well and gives certainty to the police and everyone in terms of what's illegal and what isn't. A more recent example, which you won't know about, unless you're a tech lawyer, is the e-commerce directive. Great piece of legislation. 2000, it was passed, and it sets out the standards by which all internet online commerce has to be transacted. So it took the existing social practices online, baked them into a set of rules, went through the European legislative process, implemented in every member state, a fantastic piece of legislation. Every time they look to reopen it up, they say, actually, we should leave that alone. That one works. That works quite well because all websites have to adhere to the rules set out in the e-commerce directive when it comes to transacting and doing business online. That being said, I think the trend in the recent past has been to reach the statute book, and that's created all sorts of problems. So I want to talk about a few examples in the news recently to illustrate these points. Take that terrible story about sexting on the news last month. I couldn't believe it. It was such a tragic incident. For those of you who don't know about it, a 14-year-old schoolboy in Manchester took an indecent image of himself and shared it by text message with some of his, a girl at school, who then chose to circulate it around the school. And obviously, the poor kid must be mortified by what happened, no doubt about it. But the headmaster decided to get the police involved, and as soon as the police get involved, it becomes a different discussion. The police are constrained by rules around evidence and what they have to do, quite rightly so. So it then becomes a notifiable offence, because technically he's breached the Criminal Justice Public Order Act, which makes the dissemination of indecent images of children illegal. And then we have the obscene situation where the headmaster, rather than having a conversation with him as a 14-year-old boy, is saying to him, oh, it's a criminal offence, the policeman's here, he gets interviewed without being cautioned. And then he's told at the end of this whole process, if you apply to work with schools in the future as a grown-up, when you want to work with young children, you should be aware of the fact that this will appear on a deep search if we do a Criminal Records Bureau search. This is a disaster. And what should have happened, I'll be completely judgmental about this, the headmaster should have said to the 14-year-old boy in question, that was a stupid thing to do, wasn't it? Take a few days off if we can make arrangements for you to be looked after. I'm going to go and speak to the school about it and suggest to everyone at the school, you shouldn't really be engaged in this kind of behaviour, and if you do, look at what you might expose yourself to. And that's all part of being a teenager and going through that process, and we need to have adult open conversations, rather than get the police involved. So the headmaster saying, on the one hand, I'm going to give you a good education, but also in the process, I'm going to criminalise you all at the same time. And so the headmaster in that situation, or that school, I think, failed in its social responsibility to address an issue that could have been dealt with easily within the confines of the institution that was there. And you have posed the question, why did that happen? Why did the headmaster feel the need to get involved? So don't blame him personally. It's more that once we've introduced all these laws, you feel the need to get the agency of the state involved. And when that agency gets involved, it leads to all sorts of issues, such as the non-resolution of what should be a fairly straightforward problem and the creation of a whole set of new problems in terms of this 14-year-old boy and the school in question. Another example, the Counter-Terrorism Act that's just been passed that places an obligation upon schools to look out for signs of extremism. Now, this is, I think it's a terrible piece of legislation. You now have the obscene scenario where you've got Muslim kids in East London being forced to fill out questionnaires at the age of 8, 9, 10, 11 to see that they're not expressing views of an extremist nature. And then you have the criminal sanctions contained within that bill, which might be used by the police or the school to pass orders against them. I heard on Radio 4 the other day, some 5-year-old got questioned because he expressed a view about girls not wearing the hijab. Why is the law involved in those discussions? Why can it not be down to the schools and the parents to have a discussion? There's a discussion to be had, but I don't see that how the state getting involved in legislating that area resolves those problems. In fact, it creates more problems, and it denies people the ability to, or the obligation really, to take responsibility for dealing with those issues outside of the legislative framework. So I guess the point I'm making is be very reluctant to legislate. The law should be there to set the parameters, to regulate relationships between individuals and the state, and where necessary to set out the standards by which relationships between individuals and society should be legislated and regulated, and give a legal framework within which we all have certainty as to what our rights and obligations are. That's a good thing. When the law goes beyond that in terms of regulating individual behaviour, and you get that place of the state involved, be very careful about what the consequences are. And the trend over the last 10 to 15 years has been mostly, in my view, a negative trend, because we're involving that apparatus much more in the resolution of disputes and personal relationships, which should really be left to ourselves to resolve on our own terms, in our own way, as best we can. And it's all part of being human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Matthew.
Are there too many laws? Well, it doesn't actually depend on how many laws there are. What matters is whether they're good laws, and one can have a lot of laws which have very little effect, or one small law which has a huge effect. So I'm not sure that the question, are there too many laws, is that easy to answer. But the laws that we do have, there are a lot we could do without, and we're also in the process of introducing some pretty stupid new ones. And I'd just like to look very briefly at our drugs laws, because for reasons which I'll come on to in just a moment, very briefly, I think our drugs laws are a complete mess, and we're just about to make them even more of a mess with something called the Psychoactive Substances Bill, which some of you may have come across or heard about. This is a bill which is going through Parliament. I think there's not much doubt it's going to be passed. And the purpose of it is to ban the supply or importation of any psychoactive substance. And the problem is the definition of a psychoactive substance is so broad. I've made a note of it here. It's this. It's any substance which, by stimulating or depressing a person's central nervous system, affects the person's mental functioning or emotional state. Now, as lots of people have pointed out, that could apply, for example, to sniffing a nice smell from a flower. It's a complete absurdity. And, of course, it's not going to necessarily result in flower sellers being prosecuted. But why on earth do we have to have a law which criminalises the sale of flowers and lots of other things too? There's a much more serious side to it, but lots of more serious sides to it, in fact. What it's going to do is criminalise things not on the basis that they cause harm to anybody, which is a defensible reason for criminalising something, but simply on the basis that it has some sort of psychoactive effect, even if that's a good psychoactive effect. It's going to criminalise certain sections of society, people such as gay men who use amyl nitrite, poppers, in nightclubs. There was a bit of doubt to start with whether they were going to be covered by this bill, but it seems that they are. People from Southeast Asia who may chew betel nuts, which they're not very good for you. They might even give you cancer, but that's not the reason that they're being banned. They're being banned because they have a very mild psychoactive effect, rather akin to weak alcohol or caffeine or something of that sort. So this is a very, very bad law, and it's based upon the idea that we should control drugs by the criminal law. And that, as I say, has already been shown to be an utterly dismal failure. Nobody thinks that works in practice. People use drugs. People, more importantly, suffer the ill effects of drugs, and they do so more than ever before. Again, I was looking at the statistics. Last year in England, I think it's England and Wales, in fact, 2,248 deaths from people involved in illegal drugs, mostly heroin and cocaine. This is a disastrous law. What has actually been shown to work much better is the law that they have in Portugal, which is effectively to decriminalise all possession of all drugs, whether they're heroin or cocaine or cannabis or anything else. It hasn't led to a huge explosion in drug use, and what it has done is dramatically reduce the death rate from people abusing drugs. The figures are quite startling. In Portugal, they now have a death rate of about 3 people per million. The latest statistic, I think it dates from about 3 years ago. In England, 2014, the latest figure I saw was 40 per million. 3 per million in Portugal, where drugs have been decriminalised, 40 million in England. It doesn't work. Sweden, often thought of as a very liberal and free and easy place, well, in fact, it's not as far as drugs are concerned. They have a very punitive drugs policy there. It's been a complete disaster because although the rate of drug use is relatively low in Sweden, the deaths and ill health from Class A and amphetamine use in Sweden is amongst the highest in Europe. So we have an appalling Misuse of Drugs Act, which has failed in any way to deal with the mischief of drugs, and we're just about to add to it another appalling law, this Psychoactive Substances Bill, the only real effect of which will be to push more dangerous drugs into the hands of criminal gangs who will be rubbing their hands with glee at the thought of dealing with yet more illegal drugs. It's a shocking state of affairs, and that certainly as far as drugs are concerned, yes, we do have far too many laws.
Thank you, Matthew. Now, Josie.
Thanks. No, I think, which is something very much drawn out by the previous speakers, that we're living through a very strange era now, and something very odd is happening with our legal machinery. And the whole kind of logic of the legal machinery and the whole kind of the way in which people like Max Weber or the kind of classic theorists of law, the way that they describe law and said what law is, all that stuff has just been written off now. Those books have been thrown away. You may as well tear them up. They don't mean anything anymore. Because the classic basis of a law was that the only role of law is to protect the freedom of individuals. So, and the whole kind of principle of what a law is derived not from actually from what the state wants or what's necessary to hold together a society, but the points at which one person violates another. And so that Daniel's kind of classic tome, which he very much admired at university, and that actually has origins in common law, centuries beforehand, and even Mesopotamian law and that kind of thing. You find those basic infringements of trespass, aggression, those sorts of things. In archaic law, you find a whole bunch of other stuff as well, such as Chinese law saying you must love your first wife more than your subsequent ones. Obviously, kind of enforcement of taboo and those sorts of things. But as time went on and law became modernised, those elements were stripped from the law. And so in the French Revolution, when they were making laws, they decriminalised homosexuality. They said it's a victimless crime. The role of the law is not to say what is the right form of conduct. It's only to deal with those points of infringement. And I think that was the whole kind of the trend towards modern law, and that no longer holds now. I think that what we're seeing very much, however, isn't a return to Chinese archaic law or anything like that, but it's a more detachment of the legal mechanisms and the coercive instruments of the state from any kind of social grounding. So they're kind of chucked about. They're kind of laws are written here and there and everywhere, and powers are handed out, penalties are issued, but in a way that is detached from any kind of social logic. It's sort of essentially the whim of this party or that to ban this or restrict that. So one law that we're campaigning against at the moment are public spaces protection orders, whereby councils were given powers to ban anything that has a negative effect on the quality of life, a detrimental effect. So, which is very open-ended, and so they're kind of banning all sorts of things. And it really, it is through the law that the questions of what a good town is or a good city is being decided. So essentially, if somebody thinks, I don't like that, they think there should be a law against it. And that's, I do a lot of local radio, and there's always, I don't like this, therefore there should be a law. So you've got criminalisation of spitting, for example. Charity collectors, chuggers, people really don't like them because they're walking down the road, they don't want to talk to them, don't like leafleteers. Things people don't like are being banned. So I think that kind of projection of one's subjective likes and dislikes into the legal format and the negotiation of what is a good way of behaving or what is a good town through the legal format is very much occurring. Essentially, if one believes something, there should be a law on it. If something is right or is true, then you think there should be a law, and it should be enforced through wardens issuing fines. So the spitting laws, for example, you essentially, there's an idea that you can't actually talk to young people and say, it's disrespectful to spit, when an elderly person walks past you. That's disrespectful. You should stop doing that. People say, oh, but we can't do that. Essentially, we need wardens who issue fines. Essentially, the basic social regulation of civil society is essentially outsourced to wardens issuing tickets. This is the only form of sanction or persuasion, is the officer handing out a ticket. The only way of saying you believe something is to say it should be a law. So I think that what really is happening is the categories of law and civil society and state and civil society, which developed at the origin of modern law. When they said, okay, that the only role of law is to stop infringements of people upon one another, by definition, you then created this whole sphere of social life, which was a law unto itself. Because you basically said you can do anything so long as it's not banned. And so that sphere of social life had its own ways of resolving things: argument, persuasion, morality, social pressure. And Max Weber, in his book about law, basically says, actually a very small part of social order comes from the law. And there are things that are much stronger than the state. So actually, the role that criminal law can play in creating social order is really very, very minimal. And so the requirement is for civil society to be self-regulating in that way. And that is now being undermined. I think what you have then is very much the undermining of civil society, morality, ethics, those sorts of things. But you also have the complete corrosion of law as a system and it being brought into disrepute. So the ASBO, for example, which is very much a completely, giving a power to an official to say, you must not do this to a particular individual. So that's the antithesis of law. Completely held in they're seen as a joke. So I think that as soon as you reduce law to being nothing more a subjective impulse of an official, then you corrode it as a system. And actually the important role that it does play in setting certain norms and providing certain limits is undermined. So people don't actually know what the law is anymore. You don't actually know if this is a crime or not a crime. And as a result, you don't terribly respect an official who's coming up to you telling you not to do something because you don't know who he is. He's got a fleece on, maybe he's got a badge or something. He says he has a power, but you don't know where that power comes from. So I think that the whole dynamic is very much extending the law, but also destroying it and destroying the authority of power-bearing officials to actually provide instructions such as they are necessary. So I think that the whole trend, what you're seeing, is very fundamental, and the abolition of important distinctions that have been there for centuries in terms of the fundamental role of the law and the separation between law and society. Those things are all being called into question, and really you're seeing very much the destruction both of social life and also of the legal machinery itself.
Thank you very much, Josie. So, just to sum up, we're in favour of smoking in public places, we're in favour of sexting, we're in favour of drugs, and we're actually quite okay about antisocial behaviour in public places. I'm trying to be provocative. Hoping that you've all been able to find your white handkerchiefs, I'd like to see some now, please.
Hi. You'd expect things in society to become tighter under all these laws, and I'm not entirely sure if they are or not. Once you start populating the society with laws, and you end up with the definitional issues, and that really kind of, when you start trying to define interpersonal behaviour, there's so many different nuances and different understandings that can. I mean, if you, for example, if you just try and define love, there'd be as many different definitions as there are people in this room, but that's what the state's trying to do. So in terms of children, in Scotland, we're moving from a fairly kind of tight category that the social work used to deploy called at risk, to now, under the named person legislation, having a cause for concern. And that cause for concern is going to be deployed by people who've been co-opted by the state to be their agents. And that will be subject to their own particular prejudices, concerns, or whatever. And that leads not just to problems for me as a parent when I allow my 4-year-old daughter to cycle to nursery without a helmet on, and the head of the nursery says, "Isabella, you haven't got a helmet on," when she's really talking to me, and that's causing her a cause for concern. She'll become the named person, and she could then go on and raise that. But it also causes problems for the state, because you just end up with the state being overburdened, overrun with people's stupid, petty prejudices becoming subject to law. And that really, I think, in January, when the named person kind of provision kicks in as an example, is going to start pulling society apart further when you're trying to legislate for all the different kind of dispositions that people may have.
I agree very much with the point that it's not necessarily the number of laws, but more to the extent to which they're applied. An example from my hometown of Brighton, which is all lovely and right on, and they don't like this and they don't like that. They use really kind of ordinary laws, the Brighton City Council, to kind of ban anything they don't like happening almost anywhere in the town or in any of its buildings. So they use things like fire regulations to ban hate speech or those kind of more provocative young black men that don't like homosexuals. You know, anything like that they will use different kinds of laws that have always existed, that are originally intended to stop people kind of like being burnt to death in a fire or, you know, not being able to get out and all that kind of thing. But it's that attitude to the law that it's pushed through to every tiny little nook and crevice of people's lives and their feelings. Brighton's got far too many stupid laws to really go into now. The 20-mile-an-hour speed limit's quite famous. But they pushed that through the council in the face of none of the driving organisations or the Sussex Police Constabulary wanting to even enforce it. And they still think it's a great law, even though no one enforces it and actually nobody obeys it. I can absolutely guarantee. People almost speed up when they see one of these stupid 5 million quid's worth of signs that people don't, you know, they ignore. But it's still seen as a good law because we feel we've somehow sent the right message to God knows who, for God knows what reason, and the assumption is that it has somehow improved and lowered the average speeds of Brighton. Every time the police measure the average speed in Brighton, it's gone up, right? So it's not so much the laws themselves or how stupid the laws are, but the fact that there is this push from below in society and from above to try and make the law the final word, to remove all uncertainty so that everybody knows what they are supposed to be doing, and it's a stupid and dreadful state of affairs.
I simply want to quote Tacitus from 2,000 years ago. The greater the number of rules, the greater the corruption in the republic.
Thank you very much. As the panel more or less agree that there are too many laws and have shown very well the why, I just wondered if it was worth spending a bit of time or invite you to say why you think it's happened. So I would suggest a few things, and I'll be interested in your comments. One, that the laws are being made by lawmakers in order for them to feel virtuous about themselves. So it's a kind of virtue signalling which is going on, which is obviously a very common phenomenon. The second thing is that they have given themselves a cloak of morality, that they're allowed, if you like, to be the holders of morality for society, and therefore they have no trouble making laws which fit in with their version of morality. And the third thing I suggest is that there's a basic governance problem. In other words, they are not seeing what the rights of the individual are in the same way that they used to, which is effectively saying that they are now in charge and we are not in charge of our own lives. So similar to the comments you've made, but if you look at it as a governance issue, it becomes clearer, I think.
I want to propose perhaps a slightly different opinion here, in that I know there's a lot of hate coming towards our laws in this country. And I think it's important to remember that actually the majority of the laws passed by our government are to improve our society. And a lot of the laws that are passed are there to help the most vulnerable people in society. And that includes things like, you know, stopping child labour and banning smoking in public places, and recently banning smoking in cars with people under 18 in them, which is vital. And well, some people may disagree and say it's an infringement on their personal liberty, but I truly believe that it's important to protect those young children who really don't have a say in the toxic chemicals that they're inhaling. And I also think it's important to remember that the lawmaking system that we have in this country is a democratic process. We vote in the people that pass those laws. And if we don't like the system that's in place, we need to change the way that we are running the politics in this country. We need to vote new people in. David spoke about the SNP, and I can understand why for you that would be something that you're personally not very keen on. But the SNP have wiped across Scotland because the people are supporting them. The people are so engaged with the SNP. Their conference this weekend in Aberdeen has had huge numbers and hundreds of people who have previously never been involved in politics before. And yes, okay, maybe the SNP is passing a lot of laws that David here personally doesn't agree with, but if the people are supporting the SNP so much, I think we need to respect that. And if the country doesn't like that, they vote in a new system, but this is a democratic process, and I think we should respect that.
Okay, as the actual resident of Lanarkshire, I think the problem we have in Scotland is one of micro-regulation. And if we could just step back from that to one of principle, and I'm assuming that the good laws that you've cited are very much based on principle and integrity, then I think that would be the way forward.
I just wonder if the panel might think that one of the reasons that laws are, as it were, overtaking is that in general society, in Britain, not elsewhere, just where we are, people are failing to take responsibility themselves. So instead of talking to the child, you call in the authorities. Instead of, actually just happened right today, I saw a little child come along and pick up the hose pipe that goes into the lake outside and start flinging it around. And I said, please don't do that. And he was shocked that a stranger should tell him not to do it. He was about to fall in. He was about to hurt somebody, ran away crying to his parents. And I thought, gosh, things have really changed when you can't tell a child not to do something that's potentially harmful. And that's what's happened. People are, I've forgotten the word, they are failing to take responsibility. They're handing it over to the state. And there's a vacuum being created, and that's why they start making all these laws, because ordinary people, ordinary institutions in civic life are not doing it. And everyone's just stepping back, and they're afraid of being thought to be judgmental when they make a judgment. In fact, they're afraid of making judgments any longer. And so now you just call in an expert, no matter what it is you have to decide about or do something about. And I think it's terrible. It goes way beyond just there being too many laws. It's happening in all the professions where people used to be, as it were, paid for their judgment, and now they can't make judgments. It's happening in medicine in Scotland. Our GPs can no longer just make their medical judgment about their patients. It's happening in teaching. It's happening everywhere. The professions are being deprofessionalised. Laws are being made to run everything.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to bring the panel back now for them to give us their thoughts. So, David, could you kick us off, please?
Okay, I'll try. I'm actually going to try and get through most of them.
That sounds very ambitious.
On Simon's point, the Scottish Government did face problems. They tried to deal with the issue of defining what was offensive, what was an offensive song and what wasn't an offensive song. We now have a piece of legislation that doesn't really matter anymore. There's video footage of two young boys being picked up who had a banner protesting against the act. So it wasn't offensive, it wasn't sectarian, and they had that confiscated under the provisions of that act, which it doesn't cover at all. And also, there's some in relation to the named person. There's a huge issue there about risk. I'm not saying that people are badly motivated in relation to the named person. The people will be named the named person. But I know for a fact they will want to cover their backs. Absolutely, the council will want to cover its back, and what that will lead to is a risk-averse decision and assessment on any actions that they might be worried about. And I think that's going to be worrying. And I predict in the year to come we'll see a proliferation of those issues. The Brighton Council using fire regulations to ban hate speech, and also Daniel, you mentioned the stuff about sexting. And using existing laws, that is a problem, and that's a problem with social attitudes, which we'll go into. The difference here with the legislation I've mentioned is this is legislation that's actually designed to interfere in people's lives. It's not using other legislation because you're then motivated to do that. This is legislation which is designed to do that. Why has it happened? Well, I think that the SNP have learned really strong lessons from New Labour, and that was to be popular. And New Labour created a lot of laws that were populist, and I would have to concede ill-conceived. And the SNP have taken that to a whole new level, and I find that to be a problem. I also think it's happened because there's a collapse of authority in society. And it goes back to what you're saying, whether it be the authority of a politician or the authority of a teacher or a doctor. There's been a collapse in that, and there's a look to regulations to provide that level of authority. I'm nearly there. The majority of laws are passed to improve society. I agree with that completely. Actually, when I looked through the big list of laws that were passed by the Scottish Parliament, double the laws, most of them I couldn't disagree with. The Airdrie-Bathgate rail line created the new rail line. There's a budget bill, all sorts. But there are still legislation coming through as a result of that, which I don't think the majority of people in Scotland want. Finally, I agree with the point you make about the democratic right of the SNP and any government to set legislation. I agree with that. Interestingly, when I was speaking to colleagues about this issue, one of my colleagues, a councillor in North Lanarkshire, suggested that there was a problem with education about the process of passing legislation, and there was a real lack of understanding. Now, I worked in the Scottish Parliament from 1999 till 2011 for an MSP. We used to regularly get schools coming with their modern studies teacher, and the level of understanding or lack of understanding about the legislative process and what the Parliament did and how it did it was quite shocking. And that is a problem then, because if you've got these laws going through a weakened scrutiny process with a weakened committee system, and you've got people not understanding how that's happening, it's not surprising that there's not an awareness of how outrageous it is that someone's going to report Simon's daughter to the state because she's not wearing a helmet.
Daniel.
So much to respond to. I mean, I guess the thing I really want to talk about is protection. So no one here would disagree with the idea that laws should be there to deliver social good, make society a better place, set out very clearly what our rights and obligations are and what our freedoms are. And I think everyone would probably have that as a common starting point. My issue is, as soon as you get into the language protection, that's actually a code for introducing greater powers for the state to be exercised on behalf of agencies of the state to regulate your life. And so even though the person being protected, no one would disagree often with the way it's presented, the solution isn't necessarily the answer. The legal solution presented isn't an answer to the problem. So talk about banning smoking in cars with small children. No one here would say that people should smoke in cars with small children. But you introduce a law about that question, you risk criminalising families who engage in that behaviour, and you actually undermine the ability of society to have a discussion with those individuals and make that behaviour socially unacceptable. But you're not going to be able to say to the police, we want you to spend your whole time now going round, as well as issuing parking tickets and chasing people down who are doing 22 miles an hour in wherever it was. You want to also start criminalising these people who are smoking in their cars. It's a question of how do you allocate scarce resources and how do you use the authority and institution of the state to achieve certain social goods. And that one, I would suggest if you're using the language of protection the way it's presented in that way, I always get very scared and very sceptical about that, because as soon as you do that, you're actually denying agency to the individuals concerned, and you're giving that agency and authority to the state. And once you do that, you're in a position where you're actually disempowering people and stopping those social problems from being addressed. Give another example, drink driving. No one here would go to a party and say, oh, it's okay, I'm going to drive home drunk. I think that's okay. I probably won't get caught. That would be a socially unacceptable thing to say, and people would stop people from doing that at parties. I've been at parties where someone might have said that, and I'll say, no, you shouldn't. Get a taxi, get a train, whatever. And the point there is not that people are scared of getting busted and doing a year's ban, but the point is people understand that that's a dangerous thing to do and you shouldn't do it. And so there's a social opprobrium that stops that in terms of the self-regulation of civil society that Josie talked about, which is more effective than the law that backs the point up. Now, the law should be there. Obviously, I'm not saying get rid of the drink driving laws, but I'm trying to illustrate the point that it's that kind of I've got more faith, I guess, in the ability of social forces to regulate that kind of behaviour and have that discussion. And I'm very sceptical about what happens when the state gets involved to regulate that activity. So whenever you see something around protection, I always get nervous, because I'm thinking, actually, you talk about protect the vulnerable. By definition, you say the vulnerable can't protect themselves. Then you get into a discussion about agency, and then you invite the state in to regulate and regulate those relationships. Then the whole thing becomes problematized. And what you don't do then is have the discussion you want to have, which is to say people shouldn't smoke with their kids in the car, which no one would disagree with, but the law's not the answer to that social problem. And that's a pattern you see repeating itself. Same with the Muslim kids being invited to fill out surveys in East London schools to say, I have certain extremist attitudes. Obscene, rather than what you should be doing is saying, if there's a movement within a school where kids find IS ideas attractive, then there should be a debate within that school and within the families, within institutions, within those communities and the mosque to say, well, this isn't really acceptable, or let's have that argument out, rather than have the state involved in the Counter-Terrorism Act, and then we issue all these banning orders, and you have 5-year-old kids being questioned because they think it's women should be wearing the hijab. That's not the way to go. The way to go is to have that social discussion, not to rely upon the law to problematise that area further, and then kind of inevitably have negative social consequences insofar as it criminalises that part of society. So that's why I get really worried. Whenever I hear the language protection, I get concerned. One final example, 1893 Sale of Goods Act was not a piece of consumer protection legislation. 1893 Sale of Goods Act set out the law on contract for goods, and it's a brilliant piece of law. It's kind of restated in the Consumer Rights Act, most of it today. But the Consumer Rights Act is all about protection. So it's a very interesting kind of shift that's taken place in 100 years, where you moved from setting out rights and obligations, accepting people are free to exercise those rights and obligations in society, to a point where the state always feels the need to step in and protect. And I don't know where that comes from. The political class are probably run out of ideas. There's a lot of bankruptcy out there in terms of what they're able to do to resolve societal problems. So the language of protection gives you a source of legitimacy if you're in that political class, so you rely upon that. But in the process of doing that, you actually deny the very thing that can resolve these problems, people's own agency to take control of their own lives. That's my point on it.
Matthew.
I rather agree with the lady over here who said, well, we shouldn't assume that all these politicians are acting from bad motives. Of course, they're not. They're trying to do their best in most cases. But I don't agree with her when she says, well, we haven't voted for them in order not to pass laws, because in fact the Conservative Party, I seem to remember, who won the last election, south of the border anyway, did have a policy of, they called it reducing red tape, and I think, if I'm not much mistaken, they had some sort of scheme whereby they would repeal one law for each law passed. Now, I'm not quite sure what's happened to that. It seems to have been rather forgotten about now. But
they've got rid of the ice cream regulations, ice cream bans.
They've got rid of ice cream regulations, so there's been some progress there. But the trouble, what happens is that every so often some new panic comes along, whether it's dangerous dogs or psychoactive substances, and there's a huge hoo-ha about something which often isn't actually too much of a problem at all. And somebody says, well, something must be done. So they do something, and they say, well, we've done it. And that's how this psychoactive substances bill has come about. Sometimes we need a bit of perspective on this, because I'm old enough just to remember the breathalyzer laws coming in. And certainly in the immediate aftermath of that, which I do remember, there was a big debate about it. People saying, well, this is terrible, making people effectively testify against themselves by giving a breath sample. And civil libertarians were up in arms about the breathalyzer. Well, frankly, I don't think there's much opposition to the drink driving laws now. We might quibble a bit about whether the level is set too low or so on. It's been quite a good law. The smoking in public places law, I was against that on principle when it came in. Why? Well, really, was it necessary? I thought, well, actually, it's, I think, been a tremendous success. It's made public places far, far nicer. One doesn't now have to get onto a train and walk through disgusting carriages to sort of find the only carriage which is free of smoke. Which is always the overcrowded one. It was horrible, and perhaps at the time we may think some of these laws are not a good idea. With the perspective of looking back on them, perhaps they are quite good in some cases. One final point, perhaps repeating myself, it's not the number of laws, it's whether they're good laws or not. And as we were chatting beforehand about an article written by Joshua Rosenberg, who's always very well worth reading on anything to do with the law. And he drew to my attention something which I hadn't realised, which as a cost-saving measure, we have recently sacked about half our most senior parliamentary draftsmen. Now, if you're going to sack your best draftsmen, or half of them, or your senior ones, then the result is that even if the remaining ones are good, they're going to have far too much to do. And the result will be we get much less well-drafted laws. And I'm afraid we're seeing that. We are getting much less well-drafted laws. If ever there was a stupid piece of attempt at cost-saving, which in fact must have been counterproductive, it's that. We want the very best lawyers drafting the very best possible laws. And it really is a complete false economy to sack the best ones. Because then you end up with rubbish laws.
Josie.
I think on the question of why it's happening, I think there's an explanation from the side of the state, an explanation from the side of society. From the side of the state, I think this is one of the few things that legislative authority can do. At a time when the state is no longer a providing, forging state, actually, kind of really improving a local area. the thing you can do in a rundown neighbourhood is you can ban spitting, you can ban drinking, you can ban smoking in the children's playground. Essentially, that replaces the kind of the welfare state that actually would have sought to improve the area, to build youth clubs or hat flats or that sort of thing. So I think that this becomes the one thing that the state authority can do when other roles have gone. And that's why you have politicians saying things like, you know, I'm going to ban cigarette machines in pubs, and this is a defining historical moment, and this is going to make history. And you know, really, the way that they talk about this ban, it's very much this is their moment. It's sort of they're full of this evangelical zeal. So there is a kind of way in which this is the one thing left for the state. I think from the side of society, and they are popular. They can be popular. You know, I do a lot of local radio, and I often find myself, you know, like in the 10% minority. And I think that what happens is, as members of the audience suggested, you have had a weakening of those kind of social mechanisms for resolving disputes, and people feel they can't tell the young person to stop spitting or whatever. But once you legalise that relationship, then you actually further foment the problem. You know, once you actually say, you can't talk to your neighbour, therefore you have to call the ASBO hotline, then actually you really can't talk to your neighbour, because then the whole thing does actually become mediated through legal authority, and the tension heightens. So I think that those are the two causes. On the question of democratic oversight, I mean, I think that what you're saying would be an ideal kind of scenario in terms of the democracy working properly, but I don't think that's the role that law is playing now. You can see this particularly in terms of the laws that are created to give officials powers to order people to do things. So you have, obviously, ASBOs were the first, but you have control orders, probably like 15 or 20 different ways in which officials have the power to tell you what to do in any particular case, and if you don't do it, it's a crime. You know, so they can say to you, there's a thing called a community protection notice, and an official could come up to you on the street, you're playing music. They could literally say, stop playing tunes by that person. And they could write it down, and if you was to carry on playing tunes by that person, you've committed a criminal offence. So I think that really what you have is, in the creation of powers to order, you have the loss of the whole idea of making a law, as in specifying a generally applied rule for everybody, a generally applied kind of course of conduct. For this person, something is a crime that it's not for the next person. And so you have patchworks of law. And really what happens there with the power to order is really that law is nothing but the word of the official, the whim of the official. Essentially, whatever they think is their opinion that becomes the law, letter of the law, and you to defy that becomes the crime. And I think that really what you're saying is that would be an ideal state of scenario, ideal kind of functioning of democratic system, but I think that the role that law is playing is very different. And the way that they talk about it is as a tool. You know, they kind of say, oh, we've got these powers, and they're a useful tool. You know, the thing about that word, a tool, you know, really what they're saying is this is something I use to do what I want to do. And I think the examples that Sean gave from Brighton about them using fire regulations, that's very much what they'll essentially look through all the laws, and they can say, what can we use? So they used the Highways Act, for example, to take down lost cat posters. You know, something that was about, you know, obstructions of the highway. They essentially use that to deal with something that, you know, essentially they don't like. So I think the kind of way in which they see the legislative process as something they use, you know, quite a free and easy way, you know, is quite different. And that's entirely outside of democratic oversight. I mean, having been involved in some campaigns in these areas, you know, it's very, very difficult to challenge them, even if you can get the majority of the consultation against the new law. So Oxford, for example, was trying to ban rough sleeping, feeding the pigeons, staying in a public toilet for longer than is necessary, and various other things they decided were, you know, grievous threats to social stability in the city of Oxford, which is about the nicest, quietest city you could encounter. But, you know, and essentially, you know, 60%, 93% of the public said they'd never encountered the problem of someone staying too long in public toilets. But this did not deter them. They passed the law nonetheless. I think without reasonable excuse, they put that kind of proviso on the end of it. I don't know, but the point being is actually they're very, very difficult to challenge, and even within the council leader can be against something, it can still go through. So I think that those mechanisms are not working. That's part of the problem.
Thank you, Josie. Now, there's a number of very interesting questions for people to address, but I'd quite like the panel in particular, when I next bring them in, to think a bit more about how do you define what a good law is as compared to a bad law. And moreover, I don't think much has yet been said about this issue of vulnerable people in society, because it is often said, and I'd like to hear what people think about this, that one of the reasons for more laws is because there are vulnerable people in society who need protections.
I'm just working off what the panel said about vulnerable people, just saying that there obviously are laws that have been brought in that they're not needed, and maybe they've been used and manipulated against things that they're not meant to be. But if you think about in the last 100 years how the UK has changed, like more people have come in, we've invited more cultures, we've grown as a society, and these laws have come in to protect people. For example, now the new cultures that we have, we've brought in a law against forced marriage. This protects the vulnerable people that are being abused against this, and that wasn't around 100 years ago. And it's not a bad thing that it's around now, because we're growing as a country, because we're getting new people, new cultures, new ideas. But the reason that more laws are coming in is to protect these people that are coming into the country to look for safety. And as we grow as a world and as new things come in, surely the laws need to change and grow, and new laws need to come in to protect people from the changes in the world.
It's an issue that I've been trying to address recently, and it does concern what turned out to be a rubbish law. And it was about parents are obliged by law to see that their children attend school regularly. I think you made some allusion to this in the introduction to this debate. And there's a case that just came up yesterday, I think it came out about a man who had taken the whole thing to court, and he said, yes, I've got a right to take my child on holiday when I like, because, the obligation is simply regular attendance at school. Well, obviously, if your child attends once a week, it's regular, once a month, it's regular, once a year, it's regular. So it's obviously a crazy law. But there is still an issue, and this, we see it from the perspective of, oh my goodness, this is not an extra obligation being placed on parents, and they should have the freedom to do this or that. But then there's also the perspective of the child. We've been talking about vulnerable people, but let's just talk about children. They have a right to the education, right? So we set up schools with term times, and the schools are obliged by law to give the education. And should not parents perhaps be obliged by law to get them there? That seems to be the issue. How, if such a law should be rewritten, how should we rewrite it? That's my question.
I'm very stimulated by Josie's discussion on, and I 100% agree with the self-regulation of civil society being outsourced, and that this distinction and how the law then is corroded because it is inflated and overreaching and violated all the time. I think that's very, very true, but I want to expand that discussion and say that at the same time we have the undermining and breaking and blocking of the self-regulating capacities of markets and economic relations, and we have the same issue there that a lot of these laws and regulations lead to a kind of continuous violation and corrosion of what should have been a law there too. And I now link over to when, in the sense of liberalism and the rule of law, under which democratic institutions were growing first, we had actually much more constitutionally constrained, from America, for instance, conception of what will be the capacity of majorities to determine. And that has inflated and expanded, and I find that highly problematic. So I've never voted in this country, but I'm very suspicious of the majoritarian dictate which democracy delivers. And the current democratic process I find highly, highly problematic, and we need to have an open debate and question that. And I think there's too much blue-eyed idealism interpreting that in that room still.
Although I agree with many of the points being said, I'm a philosophy student, and actually I want to play devil's advocate. I apologise. I just wanted to, again, not an opinion that I hold, but I want to ask the panel's view on the idea, which I have encountered before, that we have stupid laws because we have stupid people, and also, genuinely, it's ridiculous, but hey. But I want to, and also how we, on top of that, how we combat this idea that there are certain people in this country who are in such a circle that they feel they are vulnerable against certain groups of people or certain ideals when they're actually not. They just need to be educated on how to live around different people.
I'm interested if the panel think that vulnerable people could be better protected with a rights-based approach. So rather than laws saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, if you actually empower people through rights.
Half a year ago, we set up this new country between Croatia and Serbia. Maybe somebody have heard of it. It's called Liberland. And we are trying to actually find that minimum amount of regulation, minimum amount of laws, and also minimum amount of taxation necessary to make a workable society. And in our constitution, we actually totally banned state from making any laws, for example, on the school system. And we truly believe that in a society, that we are able to make a society where people are responsible for the way they educate their children. And I'm just like wondering how many people in this room share the idea that they would be responsible enough to take care of the way they educate their children, that they don't actually need a state to taking care of that.
Okay, I want to hear from the panel on some of these extra questions, but please try and be a little bit briefer than last time. David.
Thanks for that. That's useful for me because I've got less to say in this round of questions. Majoritarian dictate, somebody mentioned that. I have to be honest and say that I mentioned that there's some good laws. There are actually plenty of good laws coming through the Scottish Parliament. And one of those laws was again, I mentioned that the Airdrie-Bathgate rail line, which effectively was a majoritarian dictate because it resulted in some people losing their houses and their land for the betterment of the majority. I actually don't see much of a problem with that. I think that's a reasonable thing for a legislature and for the state to do. So it's not always the case that a majoritarian dictate is a bad thing. In terms of rights, whether we should be promoting rights as a I don't know, a more positive approach to law, I think that rights legislations are equally susceptible to undermine and try to take the place of what used to be effectively social norms or community norms, and I think they can be equally as worrying. And it's a big deal. I think we need to be trying to allowing people to get on with their lives on a more natural basis within our communities, and having a bit of responsibility and having the confidence to be able to use that responsibility within our communities. And that's about me.
Daniel?
I'd agree with that last point. And so if you look at a good law, bad law, I think the problem is once you start introducing legislation, you undermine the ability of society to rely upon those mechanisms to resolve disputes. You undermine the ability of existing institutions to address questions and look at them in the round and take on responsibility. As soon as you legalise it, that becomes a problem. So what's a good law, bad law? For me, it's fairly straightforward. It would be a good law is one that sets out the parameters around what rights and obligations are between the state and society and what those are between individuals, insofar as that activity needs to be regulated or given certainty. And as soon as you start going beyond that in terms of giving the state certain discretionary powers and arbitrary powers that are being exercised to achieve certain ends, you always have to step back and question whether or not that's really what we want to be doing in terms of how those powers might then be exercised and not subject to proper public scrutiny. And we've had lots of examples of how that's happened today. On the Forced Marriage Act, and back to this point about vulnerable people, again, I'm really kind of sceptical about this. So I can't believe there wasn't an existing criminal law that made forced marriage a criminal offence. I may be mistaken on that. I'm not a criminal lawyer, or rather haven't practised criminal law for a long time. The problem is if you take these acts together and put them in the round, you combine the Anti-Terrorism Act and the Forced Marriage Act. To me, those things say that the Muslim community has been criminalised. That's what that says to me, more than it does say to me that they're actually trying to stop, through the implementation of that law, the socially abhorrent practice of forced marriage. So I'm not, as a liberal, I'm opposed to forced marriage. What I'm questioning is whether or not those acts of parliament in that way will actually achieve the socially stated end. Isn't there a broader discussion to have around multiculturalism? What are the values we live by? What values does this society want to live by? How do we have that conversation and have that ideological argument with the different communities now make up modern Britain? And that's the argument we should be having, I think, rather than constantly resorting to the statute book and finding that we'll introduce laws that will then have unintended consequences. I'll give another example. The Stalking Law, passed in 1997, is now known by most family lawyers as a Protection from Your Husband Act. Now, that's not to say that husbands who engage in domestic violence against their wives shouldn't be subject to some kind of criminal sanction, but it is to point out that the anti-stalking law was passed with one problem in mind, which was already kind of criminalised by the Offence Against a Person Act, the criminal offence around assault. But in practice, it's then been used for an entirely different social purpose, not a purpose that Parliament was invited to legislate upon at the time, but something which has then hit the statute books and been used by family lawyers. And rather therefore be a parliamentary discussion about how do we police domestic violence, we find this statute being used for purposes other than that which was originally intended. So I'm not arguing defence for 1 second of domestic violence. What I'm questioning is, be careful when we introduce laws around protection, how they might be used and to what end they might be used, and often used for purposes other than that which they originally intended. And then you introduce the ability of the state to exercise these kind of arbitrary powers, and it can have consequences that none of us would regard as necessarily desirable or positive or progressive.
Matthew.
What makes a good law? Well, first of all, it has to deal with a real mischief, a real serious problem, not some imaginary problem. Secondly, the law needs to be well drafted, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be limited in scope so that it only deals with that particular mischief and doesn't spread its tentacles into places where it wasn't envisaged. And thirdly, it needs to be effective so that it's enforceable. One slight doubt I have about the Forced Marriages Act, which has been raised, is it certainly deals with a mischief. I'm not sure whether it's clearly drafted, but I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. I have real doubts whether it'll actually be effective any more than the Female Genital Mutilation Act, which has been tested once in an absolutely disastrous prosecution. We're all against female genital mutilation, but I'm not sure that's a very good example of a law which has actually been effective. Rights-based approach, the gentleman over on the less favoured side of the room mentioned, the Human Rights Act hasn't actually been talked about. That is a law which I think has been actually very effective. I'm a great supporter of it. And I think one of the effects of that, direct effects, is that new laws and regulations have to be interpreted as far as possible so that they're compliant with the Human Rights Act. And all right, we can overstate the importance of that quite easily, but nevertheless, I think on balance, it's been a strong force for good. It's still, I suppose, a relatively new law and a very good one. I'm not very familiar with the laws passed in Scotland. Most of them sound absolutely awful. The only one which David mentioned, which he said he supported, is if I got this right, it's a law which takes property from people that have it to give it away for the betterment of the majority. Well, I have to say, I don't fancy a law like that being passed so that it takes away my property. I want to hang on to it. And
fancy driving home at night.
So I'm not quite sure I agree with him, but perhaps I've misunderstood that particular Scottish law.
Josie.
Yeah.
You will get another chance at the end.
Sure, don't worry. On the question of whether vulnerable people are protected by law, in our campaigns on public spaces protection orders, the main target of these laws is actually street drinkers and homeless people and young people. Essentially, some areas you've got a law that a young person cannot gather in a group of 2 or more unless they're standing at a designated bus stop. Some, it's a crime for a young person to enter an area. Lots of targeting of homelessness, no begging, no aggressive begging, no begging near a cash machine, no loitering near a cash machine, all those sorts of things. They are, in fact, these vulnerable groups is the primary target of this legislation. So I think there's no consistent use of law to protect vulnerable groups. I think the role of the vulnerable group is different. I think the vulnerable group is a kind of state-constructed idea. Essentially, what it means is it's the non-subject requiring state protection. So it's a category that's created to justify the state intervention. So if you look at the category of vulnerable group to do with child protection legislation, for example, that includes all under 18s, and it includes all elderly people or people receiving healthcare. You look at the British population, pretty much 2/3 of the population are a vulnerable group. And in every case, what they've done is they've polarized a relationship. So essentially, somebody is going to help kids. So they go into school and listen to reading. In that case, the children are the vulnerable group. The person helping is the potential aggressor. If one of the children would go into the old people's home, it would be the elderly people who would be the vulnerable group and the 16-year-old who would be the potential aggressor. In every case, they've polarized the relation into aggressor-victim. And the role of the vulnerable group is to justify the state intervention. It's not an actual no one says I'm a member of a vulnerable group. There isn't a kind of a demographic category or an identity category. It's essentially in every case it's a state construction. They'll say there are this many million vulnerable people, but in every case it's basically to justify the intervention. So I would really question the idea that this works in the benefit of the vulnerable.
I'm just playing the devil's advocate here, and I understand what I'm going to say is quite an unpopular argument. But perhaps the problem is not the law or their number, but the problem is our reluctance to comply and to cooperate with the state. Our problem may lie with our tendency to believe that individual liberty is a natural and a universal right.
We've been talking very much about social issues, although there has been at least one question here about the role of regulation and market. So I wouldn't mind if anyone, perhaps particularly on the panel, could think about that. To what extent is legal regulation now undermining market forces?
Just two questions. The first one, I think, was to Josie. She mentioned that there was a significant change in the conception and practice of law away from one in which individuals were self-regulating towards where the state intervened more. Just wanted to know if you could answer what's driving this change, what precisely drove the change, and is there a coordinated force to reverse this change back towards self-regulation? Are there groups challenging authority to reverse the conception and practice of law? The second question, in a sense, touches on this question about markets. We've seen, I think everyone would dispute, it'd be difficult to dispute the globalisation of the world, the increasing globalisation of the world. And this brings new concepts with it, like global citizens and the global economy. And given this international context, is the capacity of the state to legislate for this kind of environment limited? And if the capacity of the state is limited, is the capacity of individuals to self-regulate in an international context limited, particularly given the fact that we're recognised as national individuals, interpreted by our nationality, our national identity, our national rights?
Hey, so, I went into politics because of the imposition of an unjustified speed limit based on a pack of lies. The English and United States laws are based on freedom compared with the Roman law and Code Napoleon, which are based on instructions. Now, last time I looked, the EU had produced over 300,000 pages of regulations, which is 5 times the size of my Encyclopaedia Britannica. And it does deter me from setting up another company. But my two questions are, how can we repeal a large number of laws en bloc, say 50 at a time? My second is, at what age would I be deemed to be too old to face a court, or maybe I'm in a vulnerable group?
So there were some comments made about idealism, and I'd like to pick up on that idea. One of the things, especially that Daniel has been talking about, is how, we don't really need all this legislation because deep down we're such great humans that we can actually, just by ourselves, police ourselves to live well and do the right things for our families and for the people around us. And to be honest, I think that is a little bit idealistic. And I think, it would be great if we all had the same perfect moral compass, then we don't need strict legislation to stop things happening, like, to stop smoking in public places. But the reality is that we don't have that across our society, across any society. And sometimes legislation actually creates public opinion, and it moves public opinion forward, like the banning of smoking. I mean, you said yourself it changed your opinion. I'd also like to raise about having those cigarette machines that you can get that you can't get anymore in pubs and places like that. In Germany, you can still, and I actually feel that really does affect the fact that in Germany there are still far more smokers than there are in England. And I'd say that the idea, the mentality we have towards smoking in this country as not being incredibly positive is because there was a lot of legislation in place that is trying to regulate smoking and stop it in public places and stop it harming other people. And one other example I'd like to draw upon is the act which banned the death penalty. Because at the time that was passed by Parliament, the majority of people in the UK were in favour of the death penalty. Now, much later, I mean, years have gone by, a lot of a lot of people in modern society now actually would say in the UK that the death penalty isn't maybe the best and the right form of punishment. And I actually think that, debatable, but I think times have changed in some ways. And I just think that, we can't necessarily rely on every single human in this country, as great as we may be, to be able to morally please ourselves. I just don't think we can rely on that, to be honest. We need legislation for that.
I'm of the opinion that the country's future leaders and legislators are being educated in universities which are increasingly moving towards censorship. The harm principle has been replaced by the offence principle, and effectively policing rules a day. Do the panel think this is likely to have an impact on law in the next 20 to 30 years, and is a general trajectory of the statute book moving towards censorship and less freedom?
The panel asked once, there was a question that the chair asked, what's the difference between a good law and a bad law? And the definition given was a specific law and how easy it is to enact a law, but on what subject? For example, some people think laws that restrict our liberty, laws that on hate speech or the anti-terror legislation, they're bad because they restrict our liberty. But laws where the government also intervenes, for example, social housing or social care, many people see this as good. What objective, or if we do use something that's objective, how do we judge what's a good law and what's not in how it helps the people? And my second question is on, I think it's a response to another woman at the front. If all people are bad, what gives the government the right to think that they're good, that they are better than the rest of us? Because, in my opinion, the government are the 100 men that belong to the people, not the people that belong to the 100 men. And if the government do think they're better than us, in my opinion, they're acting like the massive Tumblr feminist. They're protecting these victims, as you call them, from themselves, the big victims from other people. We're not victims. We're autonomous beings. We can decide what's right for ourselves. We can decide how we act, and we know how to look after ourselves. Okay? And what gives this Tumblr feminist the right to dictate what's good for us and dictate how we behave? Thank you.
Just listening to some of the debates, there's this view in the room that we're all able to self-regulate. Daniel, you mentioned earlier about the extremism laws, how we should just be able to self-regulate in schools. It's been proved that doesn't happen. It's been proved that bad things are still occurring. That's why we have children going to Syria, and that's why the laws come in to protect them. People can't self-regulate. We've seen it time and time again. That's why people still spit. That's why parents are taking their children out of school. That's why the laws come in. I can't see that much evidence that we are that good at self-regulating without the law.
I was just going to say, the way that everyone's been treating it is as if because the laws exist, it means that everyone obeys them. And I think that just by putting in a law doesn't mean that the society has become better. And for example, with the laws like forced marriage or domestic violence, it actually makes those people a lot more vulnerable, because by making it a criminal offence, it makes it maybe they're more afraid to sort of be more open and public about it. And forced marriage makes them obviously have to now hide it, and I guess the husband wouldn't let them come out about it. So I think that by just saying that there's a law that is in place now, doesn't mean that it's a change.
In regards to laws being targeted towards particular groups and business regulations, could the same be said for the minimum wage law? Milton Friedman previously called it the most anti-Negro law in the books, as it discriminates against lower-skilled workers and also voluntary transactions. The same can also be said of drug laws in the US and the UK, as disproportionate numbers of ethnic minorities are imprisoned for victimless crimes.
Thank you all very much for those questions. I'm going to ask the panellists now to sum up. They're each going to have 1 minute only, and I'll remind them I've still got my tape. David.
I'm going to sum up by way of addressing some of those questions quickly. Someone spoke about market forces. I'm not sure whether they were speaking in favour of letting market forces go on with it. I'm glad to be able to actually prove that I'm a Labour councillor, not a Liberal councillor here, by saying that I'm in favour of a stronger, bolder state in terms of market forces, and I don't believe market forces act in a progressive manner. Repeal a large number of the laws. I think you probably need to adopt anarcho-syndicalism for that, so you should go for that. Strong moral compass. I think that there is an issue here, though, because I think that all the evidence, in fact, society is not run by policing, and effectively most of society is run by self-policing. It's already run by strong moral compasses. We should be seeking to take actions that reinforce that and build that and reduce the need for actual policing, and not take actions that do the opposite. So we should always be arguing to help to build strong moral compasses. Harm prevention principle, is that the way forward? Well, In Scotland, that certainly appears to be the case. We've got getting it right for every child in Scotland. We've got early intervention as the basis for all of our children and young people policy, and that's all about looking at what might happen rather than what is happening.
Daniel.
1 minute.
That's quick.
Yeah. I think I've got a different starting point from the people on the left of the room. No pun intended. Maybe that was deliberate, where the room was organised. But the person who said it's all about you have too much faith in self-regulation, or you have too much faith in the ability of us to police ourselves. I see the question the other way around. I mean, why do you talk about the need to police yourself? Why do you need to talk about the need to regulate yourself or have self-regulation? Shouldn't the debate more be about liberate yourselves, empower yourselves? And that's the point. Because the more and more law you have in civil society, fundamentally, the less and less, the more and more you actually disempower people and prevent them from being able to exercise power of their own lives. So you and I we would have the same opinions in terms of certain social problems, but I wouldn't see a legal solution to those problems. And it's just naive to think that something like the Forced Marriages Act or the Female Genital Mutilation Act is actually going to stop what we would regard as abhorrent social practices. So the point I'm saying is that there's much more political capital, much more political efficiency in resolving those problems to people taking power of their own lives and having those arguments and having those discussions and winning those points. And so the person who said, oh, but we're global citizens, aren't we less powerful? I say it the other way around, actually. As individuals, we have more access to information, more access to power than we've ever had before. We're the most educated group of consumers in all history. So in terms of being a global citizen, I'd see the upside to that, not the downside to that. I can have dialogues with people in Greece against austerity. I can have conversations with friends in Malaysia. And those are kind of dialogues and discussions you couldn't have had 40 years ago before the internet and before that kind of stuff. And then finally, on the law market, bear in mind, most law now comes from trying to make the European single market work. Discuss 40-odd directives in the last 10 years, God knows how many hundreds since the Treaty of Rome. But in that context, we are part of a bigger political project around the single market, whether we like it or not. And so I wouldn't see that as a problem. I see that as, again, there's an argument, it's a whole separate debate, but there's an argument to be had there in terms of having more power over that market to legislate effectively, rather than to trivialise people and to take away people's powers.
Matthew.
Well, I think I agree with Daniel that really there should be a presumption against making law unless it's really necessary. And every law that is made is, or perhaps not every law, but most laws that are made have the effect of reducing liberty, and I think that needs to be justified when it happens. Second point I'd make, I'm perhaps repeating myself a little bit, I think you need a sense of perspective, because very often the way a law operates in practice is different from the way that was anticipated, and we should be more ready to realise when laws turn out to be bad and repeal them when they're not working. Equally, we should be ready, as I've done, as the smoking ban, to change my mind, and we should change our minds if laws actually we didn't much like the sound of that have rather a good effect. And finally, the lady who asked down here how old did she need to be before the criminal law would overlook her, and I'm afraid the answer is it will never overlook you, madam. And the prisons are filling up with elderly people, and even if you become toothless and mindless and senile, I'm afraid the law will still pursue you, as Lord Janner knows to his cost, or his family at least knows to his cost.
Josie.
And on that, there's a gentleman serving time for feeding the pigeons.
Yes.
On the undermining market forces, I think it very much does that. And I think that really what happens is, because there's a lack of predictability to the legal machinery. You know, Weber said this is very essential that you always know in the market how the coercive mechanisms are going to affect you, so you can plan and that sort of thing. That's just not the case now. You've got legal high shops across the country getting raids, dawn raids from council officers who've decided overnight that it's actually illegal. You know, so someone in good faith has bought their imitation cannabis and coke, and in the existing legal conditions have set up their business, and the next day it's seized. So I think that in those cases, it's actually those chaps who are representative for the law and the raiders who become the cowboys. Finally, on the question of how we're putting too much faith in the people, I mean, I think, look at it the other way around, which is how could we expect an official issuing a fine to resolve a question such as basic morality and civilised behaviour? In Croydon, they're going to make it a crime for rowdy and or inconsiderate behaviour. So they employ a private company on commission to issue fines. They get £45 from every £75 fine issued. The idea that those people going into Croydon, finding young people on the streets for rowdy and or inconsiderate behaviour is going to in any way create a code of civility or respect, or for those people, their disrespect for the law is going to be amplified by 100 times, is just nonsense. These things, social mechanisms are not working properly, but in every case, you create a warden, you create a nonsense crime like that, you're going to make it 100 times worse.
I'd like to thank all of you for attending and also for asking some very interesting questions and some very interesting contributions. But also, you may now thank our panellists who have made this debate so interesting.